Back to Freedom Day commemorations now. In his address earlier today, President Cyril Ramaphosa acknowledged that earning 20 Rand an hour is not a living wage, but he said this was just the first step to address low wages in the country. He said the introduction of a minimum wage bill would help assist 6.6 million people who are still earning less than 20 Rand an hour. President Ramaphosa said government was in the process of fixing state-owned enterprises to make them more efficient and effective. There's also a commitment to eradicate corruption in state-owned enterprises. President Ramaphosa also said government intended to use industrial incentives to procure local goods and grow the manufacturing sector. He reiterated that government would strengthen broad-based black economic empowerment.
We are fixing our state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprise by state-owned enterprise, we are putting them right. We are appointing the right people. We are appointing the right board of directors. We are straightening out their business plans. We want to ensure that our state-owned enterprises serve the interests of our people as a whole and do not serve the interests of just a few. This we are determined to do because those enterprises are owned by the people of our country. And on this Freedom Day, we want to free our state-owned enterprises of every corrupt act, of every wrongdoing. We want to free our SOEs so that we set them free to work for our people more effectively. And this we are on the way to doing. We are also using industrial incentives. We are also setting up special economic zones. We are also using our local procurement requirements to expand our manufacturing capacity. We do this so that we can increase the industrial capacity of our country so that we can improve jobs. And we are focusing on localization of production of goods and services. We are focusing on localization of procurement.
I'm still joined in studio by Lebo Pheko. She's a senior research fellow at the Trade Collective. This 20 Rand per hour minimum wage proposal, is it going to bridge a gap and make sure that people who perhaps are left behind earn a little bit more money and have more freedom and more decent life?
And more dignity. So it's all tied up with that. And it's also tied up with the idea of closing social inequality, right? So enabling people to have more access to basic, to basic lifestyle amenities, education, transport, and all of these things. It actually amounts to something like, I mean, there's so much guesstimating, about 4,500 rands per month, and the argument is that that's not really a livable wage for most people, and also that if we want to increase it to something a bit more palatable, like 7,000 or 8,000 rand, what is then going to be the cost to the economy? What is also going to be the cost to larger businesses? So that the different dimensions of what this means. But I think I would agree that we need some kind of a bottom line to ensure that we lift as many people up as possible. Whether 20 rands is enough, of course, is subject for the debate.
It's been said by some union members that it's not enough because people shouldn't start at that. South African companies and businesses can afford it, and there shouldn't even be a negotiation about wages on this level. Is it really feasible?
It depends, and one would probably argue that you need to have some kind of a sliding scale. So for your really small businesses, that might not be as feasible, but surely for your larger businesses, I mean, I think for your large retail cartels, your supermarket chains, your large manufacturing and your retail sector, which will earn billions of rands per year in profits, that's certainly doable. I mean, I think, we've heard the anecdotes of where one particular CEO I think, earned about over 100 million rands in a year. Those sorts of companies, I think it's fairly shocking that the least paid person in that company would probably earn about 10,000 rands or 12,000 rands in a year, the cleaner. And I think that we should remember that President Ramaphosa, in the his inaugural State of the Nation address, where he was sending us, we should probably remember that he talked about free education, he talked about re-galvanizing small businesses, he talked about the minimum wage, and these things are all about bridging social inequality. So if we're talking about free education, it means that the very people who are unable to afford education right now for their children or for their loved ones, clearly there's a case to be made for framing this within the context of a bridging social inequality. Then you have the VAT increase, which seems to in fact turn that on its head, because it means that a lot of the basic commodities, only about 20 commodities are tax exempt, are exempt from the VAT increase, right? Very small, a very small number, and the rest of them are still subject to VAT. And I think most people who are watching will have noticed the very odd pricing on many items now. Rather than 9.99, it's 10 rands 27. You know, very bizarre, but everything counts. And I think that the government needs to think about a fiscal and monetary policy that is far more inclusive of the majority of people in this country. So our consumer price index, which is basically our breadbasket of goods, has not enabled the majority of people to be able to live a life that's A, healthy in terms of basic food consumption, and B, accessible in terms of choices. And that includes, I mean, we just watched this horrible accident that took place in Cape Town. What is so difficult about infrastructure that enables people to get from one place to the next inexpensively, less, you know, and safely at all hours of the day? That's also part of, you know, building social equity and elongating, you know, different forms of productivity. If you want to go to the library and study in the evening, you should be able to do so. So this really has to be around a whole notion of an inclusive community, a community which says that if I live in a suburb, I should not be privileged to the extent where I forget that people in rural areas, in working class townships, for example, are not able to access anything. And I think that the whole idea of social migration as well and social cohesion means bringing communities closer together in relation to the things that they can access. So there should not be such a sharp demarcation between what is available for people in particular communities.
We've spoken about the impact that things like the VAT increase are going to have. There's also a balancing of that. Treasury announcing a panel of independent experts to look at expanding that list of zero-rated items, so things perhaps that aren't on there now, like sanitary pads, could be included in that
books,
to be more inclusive. Political will plays a large part in how freedom is expressed and shown to citizens in the country. Is an action like this showing that we are moving closer towards those ideals that you've been speaking about?
Not particularly, because I think that we should have really had a systemic structural overhaul of how the tax base impacts on people who are the lowest income earners, who are already socially disenfranchised and economically disenfranchised. I think that it's a pity that, you know, the whole debate on sanitary towels becomes a PS rather than being a central part. There's the children in this country, the young girls and women and young women who miss out days and days of school and work every day, every month in this country because exactly of access to feminine hygiene, sanitary towels. So it shouldn't be a PS. I also think that the whole idea of the VAT, it hasn't spoken about things like access to books, paper. So we talk about free education, but then we're going to tax the very stationery and the books that young people, that learners need to access. So there's too many contradictory policy frameworks which don't really look at each other.
It's time for a short break. I'll have more news for you when we return.